Hanukkah is a story of incredible heroism and battles and survival. Battle for the very soul of Jewish life and Jewish worship. I want you to think just for a moment, what would have happened if the Maccabees did not go against the flow? What would have happened if the temple was never cleansed and liberated? What would have happened if the temple was just turned into the temple of Zeus, like Antiochus wanted it to be? Would we even be in this room?
No.
I'm pretty certain we wouldn't, because I don't think we could have survived without the temple. I don't think it would be possible for a young family from Bethlehem to come and to bring a child to be dedicated in a temple. It would be not possible for Miriam to go through the purity ceremony, to the cleansing after the birth of her child, because that's what the Torah demands. That she's to bring a sacrifice and go through, offer a purification offering. And it says in the Gospels, as we read the Besorah, that everything was done in accordance with righteousness. So that story that you read in the Gospels would have never happened, because that story actually begins in the temple, where God comes to Zechariah and says, guess what? Your wife's going to be pregnant. You're going to have a child. And that comes Yochanan, comes John, right? And then later comes Yeshua. And everything in the Gospels rotates in around the temple. None of those things would be there if it was a temple of Zeus. So the story of Hanukkah is quite important to us. It is a pivotal moment in history that if it didn't happen that way, everything as we know it would not be. But we started reading through the stories the way Josephus tells the story. And remember, Josephus is a first century writer. He basically wrote towards the end of the first century, living in Rome. And today we're going to turn to the story from the book of Maccabees, which is a Jewish story also, written by Jason. That's the author that we know of Alexandria, so an Alexandrian Jew most likely, who just preserved those events for us and the stories of the Maccabees. And so we'll be reading today from Maccabees in particular. So let's begin. This is the first book of Maccabees, second chapter. This is how the narrative that last time we stopped at, all of the desolation has happened. Antiochus comes and he basically forbids reading the Torah, forbids Sabbath, forbids circumcision, starts to subvert the culture now into paganism, and he forces people to offer sacrifices to idols. He himself does it, and of course sets the example for everyone else. And this is where the story picks up. This is Maccabees chapter 2, First Maccabees. In those days, Menorahs, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the family of Yorev, moved from Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons. John, surnamed Gadi, Shimon, called Thasi, Judas, called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avram, and Jonathan, called Apus. He saw the blasphemies being committed in Judah and Jerusalem and said, alas, why was I born to see this? The ruin of my people, the ruin of the holy city, and to live there when it was given over to the enemy, the sanctuary given over to aliens. You ever feel like that?
Yeah.
Why am I living now? Couldn't I live in the days when Moses came down the mountain and brought the 10 Commandments? Couldn't I live in the days when God opened the Red Sea before us and we danced and we sang with joy? Couldn't I be born at some other time? Why do I have to live now through these depressing times? That is basically what he's saying. Why do I get the honor of this moment to see the sanctuary destroyed? Now, a couple of words about Menorahs. So his name in Hebrew, of course, this document was written in Greek, so all the names kind of appear in Greek. So we have Menorahs, whose name is Matityahu. It's a beautiful name. He is son of Yochanan, son of Shimon, the priest of the family of Yorev. Now, there are several orders in priestly family orders in Israel. And if you're familiar, for example, with a Jewish document from the Middle Ages called Megillat Antiochus, everybody has heard of a Megillat Esther. So we have the Megillah, the story of Esther that is being read. Well, there's an analogical version called Megillat Antiochus that was created in the Middle Ages, largely taken from the book of the Maccabees, but all written in Hebrew. We can tell it's kind of Middle Ages Hebrew. But in Megillat Antiochus, unfortunately, somebody made a mistake, and they listed Mattathias as the high priest, as a high priest, essentially. It's someone who's a descendant of a clan of a high priest, which, according to the Maccabees, predates that story by many, many, many centuries. Most accurately, no, he was from a different priestly family. So this was a priestly family, an old man with his sons, and he laments what is happening in Jerusalem. Now, he's living in the town called Modi'in. Modi'in. Has anyone ever been to Modi'in? Anybody?
I did. It's a nice town.
It's a nice town.
Very beautiful, yes.
And what I love around Modi'in is the surroundings of Modi'in. The town is great, but there's just so much beautiful nature, kind of these hills and valleys that just open up. Very green.
Yes.
Very beautiful. So many trees. Some places in Israel you go, there's not that many trees. Modi'in is beautiful with lots of trees. So if you want to get an idea of where Modi'in is, let me see. This is modern map that I kind of overlaid some of the things. So here you have Jerusalem, and right here will be the Dead Sea area. So here you have Jerusalem, and today there's Highway 1. This kind of runs all the way across, and it runs all the way to Tel Aviv. This is where Tel Aviv Yafo would be, okay? Right in this area. So there's this Highway 1 that runs all the way through. Now Modi'in is right in the middle. If you were to travel between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, Modi'in is kind of a halfway stop. It's not too far off of one, and it's a beautiful area. So a lot of times when I travel, I try to imagine what would have been like in the days of the Maccabees, and I do imagine it to be a small town as it is even today. Nothing cosmopolitan, nothing like Jerusalem at all. No hustle, no bustle, just a quiet, quaint little town with quiet life. And here's this family of priests living in Modi'in. Of course, they would travel to Jerusalem to serve when their time to serve would come, and that would be through the 3 different holidays. Okay, the pilgrim feast, they would always travel, and they would also travel when their turn, when their priestly family, their turn fell, and that turn was basically determined by lots a long time ago. And so there's successions of priestly families that would travel to Jerusalem. Nobody served there full time, by the way. Nobody served full time. Everyone shared in God's service. That was the way. Nobody owned the temple, essentially. They came, they served, they took their turn, they stepped aside, another priestly family came in, and then, of course, for the holidays, all the families came in because all the pilgrims from the entire surrounding area would come to celebrate, and they would need extra help with all the different temple duties. And so it's important to understand how that system works, because basically as you study the scriptures, you will realize how much depends on understanding how the temple worked, how the priests served, what they did in the temple. So this gives you a little bit of an idea of where Modi'in was. All right, so let's keep reading the story. First Maccabees chapter 2, we continue reading. The king's officers who were enforcing apostasy came to the town of Modi'in to make them offer sacrifice. Many from Israel came to them, and Mattathias and his sons were assembled. Then the king's officers spoke to Mattathias as follows: "You are a leader, honored and great in this town, and supported by sons and brothers. Now be the first to come and do what the king commands, as the Gentiles of the people of Judah and those who are left in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be numbered among the friends of the king, and you and your sons will be honored with silver and gold and many gifts." This priest is being asked to come and do what he's already called essentially an abomination. He does offer sacrifices. What do you think will happen if somebody of his stature, a priest, would come and now give an example to all the people, I think other people will follow him. This is a test. This is a test of faithfulness from Mattatyahu for his sons. I want you to realize that temptation is real. People have taken over your country. They're going to be running things from now on. You don't have what it takes to overpower them. And this is the new order of service. Sacrificing pigs to these pagan gods. Are you going to do it or not? Now, I know there are situations in your lives that you have probably come across where you've had to wonder about whether you should compromise or not. There may be things that you stand very firm on, the things that you're so sure of that you're willing to give up pretty much anything because you know they're true. And this is exactly what's happening in the story, in this little town of Modin. What happens next, as is being offered at, Mattathias gives a little speech. Mattathias answered and said in a loud voice, "Even if all the nations that live under the rule of the king obey him, and have chosen to obey his commandments, every one of them abandoning their religion of their ancestors, I and my sons and my brothers will continue to live by the covenant of our ancestors. Far be it from us to desert the law and the ordinances. We will not obey the king's words by turning aside from our religion to the right hand or to the left." Mattathias refuses the offer. Very clearly, very ambiguously. And because he's a leader in the community, he has given a speech in front of everyone. So what do you think is going to happen now? He's been offered a chance to lead by example, and he said, "No way, we're not doing it, even if everybody else does it." And by the way, remember Antiochus, he's ruling over different nations. Syrians did not actually worship Zeus. Zeus is not a god of Syrians, the people from Aram. Maybe you've studied them in the Bible, maybe you read about them. You know the gods that they worship. You know they had to abandon those gods to take on these Hellenistic gods. They have succumbed to the same exact pressure that is now being applied upon Israel. But essentially what I want you to realize, this is not even about gods. This is about culture. This is about stopping being who you are and becoming somebody you are not. It's a cultural turnover. It's this subversive power of Hellenistic culture, which at that time was incredibly powerful and very unifying because of the same language, the same ideas. The things that Hellenism has brought into the Mediterranean were quite amazing. Good things. Things like libraries. Cities all of a sudden started having libraries. Before, in Jewish towns, just the synagogue may have a little library, but they say we're going to collect thousands of texts and put them all together so people can come and study. Things like bathhouses. That was a good thing, I think, they brought in. Getting people clean. That was a good idea. So there's a lot of things that Hellenism brought, but they also brought the worship of gods that was quite disturbing. It's something that Israelites could not adapt to. While having a bathhouse in your community would be not a problem, and the library would not be a bad thing. I think Paul made his use of library quite often because I could see him quoting all sorts of texts that are not in the Bible. So he was quite learned. But then there's other institutions like the gymnasium, the Olympic Games. And that was a bit questionable when they brought that to Jerusalem. All sorts of things broke out. So this is the issue. He says, I am not stepping aside from the covenant that belongs to our ancestors. I'm not going to deny my ancestors and my family, all the people that stand before me. I'm not going to go that way. Even if all the other nations are going to make that choice, I'm not making that choice. So they're going to stand up, and they're not going to move. What happens next? It says, when he had finished speaking these words, a Jew came forward in sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in Modin, according to the king's command. When Mattathias saw it, he burned with zeal, and his heart was stirred. He gave vent to his anger. He ran and killed them on the altar. This is a story of freedom in many ways. And many cultures share those same stories of oppression and freedom and willing to actually die for it and go to war for it. And so here's a man of peace, a priest, whose duty is to teach Torah to his people, whose duty is to offer sacrifices when he's called upon. He's going to take up a sword and he's going to fight now. Because this is how the revolt that we know today as the Maccabean Revolt begins. He kills a man because he can't take another Jew stepping out after his speech and says, I'll do it. He won't do it, but I'll do it. I want to be king's friend. I want to get paid with some silver. I'm going to do it. So he slays them right there on the altar. It's a very dramatic scene from Gustave Doré. The story continues in First Maccabees chapter 2. At the same time, he killed the king's officer who was forcing him to sacrifice. And he tore down the altar. Thus he burned it with zeal for the law, just as Phinehas did against Zimri, the son of Salu. Then Menorahs cried out in the town with a loud voice, saying, let everyone who is zealous for the Lord and supports the covenant come out with me. Then he and his sons fled to the hills and left all that they had in their town. This is how the revolt began. Not only he killed this Jew from his town who wanted to sacrifice to the pagan gods, but he also tore down that altar and killed the official who was forcing them to do that. I'm sure they didn't have a big regiment with them, so it was just a few people. Why? Because the king's army is right there in Jerusalem. That's really what's important. And so these little towns seem insignificant, but this family rises up. He says that he burned with the zeal of Phinehas. This is the famous priestly family, again, in Israel, that comes up at the time of the plague. We learned that in the Torah, as the children of Israel come to the very edge of the land of Israel, as they're about to go into the promise, they fall into great sin and immorality before the Lord. And they're being enticed into idolatry. And Phinehas, who burns with anger, cannot take what he sees. He cannot abide by it. So he, if you remember the story, pierces one of the Israelites and a woman with whom that Israelite was about to do an unholy thing inside of the Lord. He passes right in front of the tent of meeting, right in front of the entry to the holy place, and then goes into his tent to consummate a relationship with this pagan woman. And Phinehas burns with zeal. He follows them with a spear, pierces both of them. Dead, gone. The story repeats again. And it's interesting that the author of Maccabees connects that story to this priest who also burned with zeal. And you know what it says in the Torah? That after Phinehas did this, the anger of the Lord has subsided. The favor has come upon Israel because he saw one of his servants burn with zeal. And there was hope that people were not all going to go that way. And that somebody was not going to stand by and allow everything to be destroyed. They're standing on the verge of entering the land of promise. And this is that same story. It's repeating itself. He's overtaken with anger. He kills the official, tears down the altar, and the revolution starts. They run to the hills. Now, I showed you before the map of the Modin, so if you know the landscape of where things are, if you go south, you would have more of the plains. There's a few mountains over there, but if you go north, this is where the country gets a little bit more hilly. You go towards like Emmaus and those areas, and there's a lot more hills, and there's a lot more caves to hide in. And this is where the Maccabees take up their residence. They abandon their town, they abandon their families, they run away into the caves, and now they're renegades, they're rebels. Now they're going to be fighting a war. And they actually fight that war for 3 years. And if you read the rest of the Maccabees, you know what the war is all about, because the entire book of Maccabees is really all about the events of the war that transpired. But this is the story that underlines the story of Hanukkah.